Urgent, topical, timely. Power 98.7. Getting you talking about what matters.
12 minutes before 8, well, just now 11 minutes before 8, and we go to Fix My Biz. It's that time of Monday evening. We're tackling one of the most overlooked yet critical aspects of running a startup, legal mistakes that could derail people's businesses. From unclear co-founder agreements to overlooked intellectual property, many entrepreneurs learn these lessons, unfortunately, the hard way. For this conversation, we're joined by Litelu, who's a managing director at Startup Business Campus. A very good evening, Lucky. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good evening to you and also to the listeners. Thank you for having us.
Let's look at some of the most common legal mistakes that entrepreneurs can make.
Really essential, especially as one establishes their business. And sometimes because of how exciting the startup space is, they're often neglected and they lead to really challenging consequences later on. All right, we can look at something as simple as deciding what type of registration or entity type you'll be registering for. We've seen, a lot of people, loving this concept of social entrepreneurship and so forth. And some of those entities, because they rely a lot on donor funding, impact, funding and so forth, you find that perhaps a better approach for them would be maybe an NPC versus a PTY because of possible, tax implications and so forth. So it's very important for startups to really look at that closely. We also have issues such as equity, ensuring that, when teams come together, that equity is actually offered correctly, and sometimes we are very quick as startups and entrepreneurs to issue equity. You find situations where people are just giving 50% to their friends and so forth, and it doesn't always end well.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of equity and co-founder agreements, how important is it to formalize these co-founder agreements? Because many people, of course, will just start a business based on a strong friendship or a strong kind of relationship. And what should typically be included in those agreements?
So those are really, really, critical, because they avoid future disputes. Because we start very happy in a happy place, and ultimately, as things develop, you find that there's no clarity, and that basically creates disputes in the near future. So what we typically emphasize is that it's important to have those, and a robust agreement would include roles and responsibilities, which is often a challenge in the early stages, defining who is responsible for what and how decisions will be, taken, who owns how much in terms of percentage of the equity, also clarifying intellectual property within the entity, because that's also very important. And it should, be owned by the company, not individuals, because people do lose interest over time and, or exit to other spaces and so forth. So that could be a big challenge for the startup in the future, but also just being able to ensure that, all of these are clearly articulated and as early as possible. That is something that we often, encourage.
If you have any questions as an entrepreneur, comments to ask Lucky Litelu, a managing director at Startup Business Campus, who's taking us through some of the legal implications of opening a business. You can call us on 0861 987 000, also taking WhatsApps and voice notes 083 303 7093, or on X at PowerFM 987. I'm interested, Lucky, at what point should a startup register their business entity?
Our suggestion there is really as soon as you start operating, right? Because, a lot of entities, whether funders, even incubators or accelerators, venture studios, start considering, startups that are legally registered, because that's a better approach to, to engage with a startup than, sole proprietors. And that basically opens up channels for possible procurement, possible investment, and so forth. So I say as soon as you start operating, separate matters so that, we can deal with that business as a separate entity than, just, carrying that, for yourself, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So ASAP. And then how do founders or entrepreneurs deal with registering their intellectual property, whether it's their brand or their logo or their product? And often intellectual property lawyers can cost quite a lot, which people may not have in their early stages.
There are a number of really cool resources that are available and they're open. For instance, you've got the World Intellectual Property Organization that basically gives guidelines, and they've got just detailed information around how to file for patents and so forth. But a lot of our legal entities as well in the country offer pro bono services in some instances, also around contracting. So sometimes entrepreneurs can leverage those. And I know that a lot of incubators will have relationships with legal firms to ensure that some of these services can be made available to entrepreneurs. So I would say that that's one of the things that entrepreneurs can essentially consider. But registering your provisional patent is also relatively easier, and it gives one an opportunity to have at least 1 year until the solution is well refined. So that year, one can actually be able to formalize things a little bit, better. So an incubation space and a good incubation space can be able to offer a little bit of that support for entrepreneurs that, in most cases free, because those are supported by entities or partners to incubation programs. But definitely, I would encourage entrepreneurs to protect the intellectual property portfolio. And when you talk about intellectual property portfolio, we're not just talking about, we talk about the IP assets. Make sure that you've got, you protect them. And there's intellectual property portfolio, intellectual property assets, and intellectual property. Intellectual capital, essentially, it's a collection of your trade secrets and so forth. So all of those, make sure if you're sharing anything that there's some agreements, NDAs in place to protect yourself, moving forward.
We've spoken a bit on Fix My Biz about recruitment as a startup with limited funds. How important is it for companies to have strong contracts in place with new employees as well as freelancers?
I think it's absolutely important because you do share, and especially as a startup, a lot of very sensitive information and so forth. So I think it's very important to ensure that you've got a good contract that can avoid, disputes, moving forward. So always, as startups, we underestimate our networks. Reaching out to an HR lead as you're building to say, have a look at my contract, give me guidance around what I can do, and as well as when you're setting up your board, ensuring that you've got a person who understands, the HR space and how you can comply with best practice. That's very, very good to mitigate against some of the risks. And we've seen startups go into CCMAs unnecessarily and so forth. So I think laying out a good foundation early on really ensures that startups can avoid some of those risks.
Then looking at contracts with suppliers or partners, what are some red flags that people should watch out for in their contracts?
It's important to really, highlight things as simple as important as clear payment terms, because that's often a big challenge. Milestones also around that, specifying, are there any penalties if there are delayed payments and so forth? Because a lot of businesses struggle with cash flow. We've seen this over and over again, and this affects everyone in the value chain if it's not articulated well. So I would encourage that those are incorporated in your contracts. We need also milestone payments as well, articulating that very clearly, detailing the scope of work clearly, what are the deliverables, the timelines, what the quality standards, and of course, indicating, any liabilities and so forth. Sometimes with COVID, it showed us that there are things that are beyond our control. How do you actually deal with things that are absolutely beyond your control? So I would say,
acts of God.
Acts of God, so that's very, very critical. Just ensuring that you've got someone who can advise you. And I know there's amazing legal heads in the country, who will be willing to support startups, by giving, support or even looking through your contracts when you receive the contracts.
Okay, and if a legal issue does arise, what should a startup do first? And when is it necessary to bring in a lawyer?
I would say, the most critical thing is to really analyze, right? Seek first to understand, then to be understood, right? To just really go into to understand what are the key, what is the key challenge here, right? And determine the facts and understand the context. One would then need to also look into gathering the documents and ensuring that, you analyze, you look at the contract, you look at the communication, you gather all the evidence that you have just to see, if there's anything that can essentially be done, but sometimes when the issues are more complex, that's when I would say, reach out to a lawyer to actually be able to guide you around how to, to address some of those issues. I mean, we've seen a very critical challenge right now with one of a company that I absolutely loved, 54 Collective, which is really, really amazing, supporting entrepreneurs and so forth. But because of just overlooking a detail in the contract to say how the funds can be used and what are the limitations, that actually created a situation that resulted in them being liquidated, which is a sad story. So it's critical as entrepreneurs to ensure that you pay attention to all the finer details, but always reach out because there's always somebody willing to assist.
All right. Thanks very much. That's Lucky Litelu, who is joining us on the Fix My Biz tonight. He's the Managing Director at Startup Business Campus.
Power Business was proudly brought to you by MTN. Today, we make moves.